Okay, so thank you, Elia, and thank you for coming. And if you're watching subsequently online, thank you for watching. I'm going to talk about so-called net zero targets, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of science, technology, and politics. So my first point is that we often hear people say in the environmentalist movement, we should listen to the science. And my point would be that we must be aware that science exists in society and is influenced by what goes on in society and what goes on in politics. That makes it slightly more complicated. And in the case of climate science, the connection between fossil fuel burning, industrial activity, and the increasing amount of carbon in the atmosphere and global heating has been understood since the 1980s. And since then, climate science has been about pinning down with ever greater accuracy what the effects of rising temperatures are and what level of greenhouse gas emissions are needed. Even that, of course, is a political question. It's not just a scientific question. What you or I might think is an acceptable level of global heating will not be the same as what people in Bangladesh or in small island states think. And it might also not be the same as what a bunch of diplomats and politicians at a large conference think. So it's a political and not only a scientific question. Nevertheless, I would argue that there's a way of looking at
Simon, sorry to interrupt you.
Warming.
Simon.
Yes.
I just realized that your slides are not on.
That's all right. They're coming now. It's okay. I'm going to share them now. And so let's, if I can, I'm going to share the slides. Here we go. There we are. And so my first point is that there's a way of looking at the issue of the cuts that need to be made in fossil fuel use, which is not net zero. It's the approach of so-called carbon budgets. And globally, I'd say that these global carbon budgets really are worked out by scientists. And if you look in the IPCC reports, they set out what you get if you use a certain amount of carbon between now and a certain date. And this slide is I've just lifted it from the Global Carbon Project website. They ask people to lift their stuff. There's all kinds of graphics on there. It's a site built by climate scientists. And they say there's about 8% of the carbon budget left, or less than 10 years at current emissions before the bucket is full. In other words, before we get to a point where 1.5 degrees of heating can be kept to. So that's carbon budgets. Now, the approach that has now become popular in political discourse is net zero. That's what we're here to talk about. And this slide I've also lifted from a very good report, the Not Zero report, and I've got some links in the slides which we can make available. Basically, net zero means a point where the amount of carbon dioxide that is going into the atmosphere is no more than the amount that's being taken out. Now, how can carbon dioxide be taken from the atmosphere? And by the way, when I'm talking about all this stuff, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a researcher of energy, but this is stuff that we can all learn and must learn the basics of. The ways in which carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere are basically two. One is a natural way, which is forests. And the second is a series of artificial ways, technologies that remove carbon from the atmosphere. And these are now all the rage. The other point to make about removals of carbon from the atmosphere is that the amount that's removed is extremely small. So in the UK, it's about 1/4% of what's put into the atmosphere is coming out by various means, mostly forests, I imagine. In Russia, it's much bigger. So in Russia, about 1/4 of the amount that goes into the atmosphere, is taken out again, and that's again almost all from Russia's enormous forests. But apart from forests, the amounts that are taken out of the atmosphere at this moment are absolutely negligible, tiny, hardly get onto the radar screen. But this idea of taking carbon out of the atmosphere has become significant for reasons that are entirely to do with politics. When the talk, so this is my third point, when the talks began between the leading nations about climate and with the foundation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientists began to develop computer models to inform the political debates. These are called integrated assessment models, and they show what the scientists believe will happen with a certain level of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and how that will react on the Earth's natural systems. And they've become fantastically elaborate, a huge amount of development over the last 20 years. Now, if we go back to the 1990s, the European nations, where some of the politicians got that there was a problem, were trying to persuade the USA to join the Kyoto Treaty of 1997, which would have introduced binding requirements on nations. I mean, they then wanted to achieve these requirements by means of all sorts of market mechanisms. But anyway, they were trying to persuade the US to join this treaty. And the US, like Russia, has a great deal of forests. And they thought that if they included the carbon removal in the calculations, that would make the US's numbers look better and the US might join the treaty. So they started talking not only about the carbon that the economy puts into the atmosphere, which is the point, but also this natural process of withdrawing it from the atmosphere. That might make the US's figures look better. Could we get them to join the treaty? The answer was that the US Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, when asked the question, will you join the treaty, will you ratify the treaty, voted 97-0 not to join that treaty. US Democrats, US Republicans all agreed that in no way were they going to agree to this idea of binding targets. So the whole point of that compromise was lost on the European politicians. But now the idea that you could add carbon to the atmosphere and then take it away by another process had gained currency. It was in the talks, and every opponent of rapid action on climate change in the 1990s jumped on this as a way of changing the narrative. From an oil company's point of view, I mean, just think about it, it's brilliant. Of course, we can produce a little more oil. Yes, there's a problem, but don't worry, because after you've burned the oil, driven your cars, burned the coal, produced your electricity, we will find technological ways of taking that out of the atmosphere again, and you can pay us more for doing so. So this whole idea of putting carbon into the atmosphere and then removing it artificially was music to the ears of oil companies, coal companies, carbon-heavy businesses such as car manufacturers, plastics, and all the rest. So then we got the impact of this on the scenarios that are used in the IPCC reports, and this is actually lifted again from the Not Zero report. They in turn have lifted it from one of the IPCC reports. And the point to make, you don't have to read all the small print. The point is that those yellow areas, that represents artificial removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The gray is the carbon dioxide going in, that's got to go down. And so if you compare P1 to P4, the result by the year 2100 supposedly is the same, that you're more or less with no carbon going into the atmosphere. But with P4, you're relying on massive amounts of artificial removal to reach that situation. And we're much closer at the moment to the sort of carbon removal that you see in P4 than we are to the sort of removal that you see in P1. Now, in April, 3 climate scientists, 2 Brits and one from Sweden, who'd for years supported this idea of net zero and had inputted their.
Sorry, Simon, maybe
Yes.
you wanted to say P1 and not P4, because if I understand well, P4 is there's huge involvement of carbon withdrawal technology, isn't it?
Yes.
So, and we don't have that level of technology.
No, but these graphs show you the projected emissions and removals between now and the year 2100. Now, if things go the way that is displayed on P4, supposedly, a lot more carbon can be put in earlier this century, and then it's removed later.
And they're removed later.
And
with those
that's the sort of scenario that I expect if we were having this conversation in an oil company office, people here would be favoring. Whereas you and I, Elia, would probably favor something looking more like P1, if not more, declining even more sharply.
Yes, correct.
So
Thanks.
that's okay. So I want to tell you about these three climate scientists who wrote what I think is a very good article, and I'll give you a link to that as well. In April, basically they'd gone along with this. They contributed their research. They'd explained how these scenarios could work in their articles and with their computer models. But in April, they published this article saying, quote, "We have arrived at the painful realization that the idea of net zero has licensed a recklessly cavalier, quote, burn now, pay later, unquote, approach, which has seen carbon emissions continue to soar." And very interesting what they say about the scientists who worked on these models, quote, "Instead of confronting our doubts, we scientists decided to construct ever more elaborate fantasy worlds in which we would be safe," unquote. And this goes back to my point that you can't take the science out of the social and political context. And these very honest scientists, but who are not necessarily activists like the people on this in this discussion here, have painfully reached this conclusion that basically their research is being misused by the politicians and by the oil companies and by the other social forces that influence those talks. And so we've reached a situation through this process where the UK government, which describes itself as world beating on climate, is cutting emissions at less than half the rate that scientists who actually have a method of working out these carbon budgets, less than half the rate that those scientists say that it should be. And this is this looks very technical, but again, it's not that technical. This is a graph. Again, I've lifted this. I'm not a climate scientist. I've lifted it from climate scientists, from Kevin Anderson and his colleagues at the Tyndall Centre, which is the one of the main centres for climate research in the UK. And all you need to remember is that the paper from which this is taken, the title of the paper is A Factor of Two. And what they're saying is that they've taken the UK and Sweden, two of the countries who boast about how world-beating they are in terms of climate policy, and they've actually analysed what the implications of those governments' policies are, and they've compared it with a scenario that they themselves have worked out, which would get us to 1.5 degrees of heating and no more in good time. And they've compared those two scenarios, and they basically found that things are going, even if all the government's policies worked out, and we know how often that happens, things are going at half the rate that they should be going. So I've lifted their diagram, that's in black and white. I've added the blue and green squodgy dots, and the blue squodgy dots show you the UK government's target. You'll have heard about the third carbon budget in the 2020s, the fourth carbon budget. They've now set the fifth carbon budget. In fact, this paper from Tyndall was done before they set the sixth carbon budget, and you'd have to tweak this slightly. And I understand they are working on this at the Tyndall Centre, so we can expect more research from them. But the basic story has not changed. The line with blue squodges is the pathway set by the Climate Change Committee and the government. The line with the green swodges is set by the Tyndall Centre. And the basic difference is, well, there's two basic differences. One is the government has set for itself. They actually use the words feasible limits. The CCC used the word feasible limits, or ambitious but credible reductions. So they've just put their finger in the air and asked, what could our nation contribute? And they've said, this is ambitious but credible, this is feasible. They have not said this accounts for the history of the British Empire, Britain's leading role in establishing fossil fuels, Britain's role as an imperial power in depriving other nations of stuff or anything else. They have simply said what they think is feasible and what they think is ambitious but credible. That's the way they've worked it out. The Tyndall Centre has done it differently. They basically took the global carbon budget. They worked out an amount which they thought was realistic for the developing nations to rapidly decarbonize their economies. And then they said, okay, here's what's left for the rich nations, divide that up between yourselves, and this is what the UK gets. And what their scenario shows is that the reductions in carbon emissions have to be made very, very quickly during the 2020s. So, of course, when we read in the newspapers the other day that the UN thinks that on a global scale, the emissions are going to increase during the 2020s by 16%, we start to worry very, very much. So just to bring this to an end, the other point to make is to say a little about these negative emissions technologies that are being flagged up as the way to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Quite quickly. So the first one is carbon capture and storage. It's been around for 30 or 40 years. And this covers a number of ways of basically burning fossil fuels, taking the carbon dioxide produced by that burning and storing it somewhere, usually underground. It's expensive. It's always difficult to find places to store the carbon. And after that 30 or 40 years of research, there are a handful of projects that actually work operating globally. And most of them, what they do with the carbon is that because they're run by oil companies, they pump it back into the reservoirs of oil that are underground so that they can use that pressure to do what? To push more oil up in order to increase their oil production. It's called enhanced oil recovery. So oil companies like carbon capture and storage. Power companies with coal-fired power like it because they think they can get governments, well, they're usually right, they can get governments to give them money to research this, only to find in most cases that it's too expensive to work. The second technology is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And the idea there that is instead of burning coal, oil, or gas, you burn crops produced for the purpose to produce the energy. You take that carbon, you bury it. That's the same problem. That if you don't have a disused oil field somewhere nearby or some other place to store that carbon, you've got nowhere to put it. So those problems remain the same, but more important, estimates of the amount of land needed to do this on any scale are absolutely terrifying. Biofuel Watch is a small NGO which specializes in researching this stuff, this bioenergy with CCS, so-called BECCS, has been, if we go back to the history of those climate models, and I mentioned the way those scientists felt their arms were being twisted and so on, this was the classic one which was used in the integrated assessment models to make the numbers add up without the oil, coal, and other companies having to cut their emissions quickly. This was the main technology included in those IPCC scenarios. There's plenty of examples of scientists who actually look at it with a more objective stance, rubbishing it. And I've put some links in the chat to that as well. The final thing that the techno-optimists are now raving about is called direct air capture. And you basically get a pump which is run by electricity, and you pull the carbon directly out of the atmosphere without burning it first and producing it. If the electricity is produced from fossil fuels, like most electricity in the world at the moment, you actually end up worse off than you began in terms of carbon in the atmosphere, worse off than you began. So the electricity, they say, will be produced from renewables. And there's no scenario I can imagine in the next few decades, and this is not only me, again, there's a lot of research been done on this, there's no scenario where it will be more effective to produce electricity from renewables and then use it for this, rather than putting it into the electricity grid to speed up the shutdown of fossil fuel power stations. So finally, that brings us to the question we need to ask about these technologies: who's pushing them and why? So just as the science is not neutral, so the technology is not neutral. Technologies are pushed by social forces. Why are these technologies favored over technologies that use less energy, less fuel, less materials to do the same things, so that we end up with trade unionists in the north of England, in Leeds, doing what I think is a fantastic campaign, where the companies there are trying to convert the gas grid to hydrogen, which is another technology. It's not actually taking, it's supposed to decarbonize. They want to change the gas grid over to hydrogen. What the trade unionists are saying, you don't need to do that. You need to produce your electricity from heat pumps, which is genuine decarbonization. But most of all, you need to patch up the homes where working class people live in the north of England in order to reduce the amount of electricity that is needed in the first place to keep their homes good and warm. And of course, we've seen people in the name of the organization Insulate Britain blocking motorways to bring this very, very obvious and basic technological point to public attention this week, and good for them, because this is you know, A1. This is first day of your first class if you're learning about technology. It's basic stuff that, even, as I said, I'm not a scientist. I mean, I understand it. We can all understand it. Instead of which, what we hear about is the technologies like hydrogen, direct air capture, and so on, that help oil companies, that help powerful social interests, but do not help people. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
It's a perfect hunch, Simon, because now we can talk finally about communication and persuasion, in particular, how narratives are used by different parties to convince people about why the carbon capture is the right idea, why it's not so important to insulate the houses, which is actually very difficult to support as an idea, but why there's so much delay and why that is kind of neglected. It's unclear. So maybe Jon can explain us more about how the TVs, the press are used to, I would say, manipulate people's opinion on this.
Certainly. First off, can I just check you can hear me? Good, excellent. Well, when I kick off a lot of my talks, I often start by saying that we do not live in a free and open democracy if crucial information is withheld from the people that would influence the way you vote and the demands you make of politicians. I then go on to give people lots of examples of that. I think Simon, in his talk, has given us a very clear example, and that is how many people in the UK understand the basics of what he has pointed out. How many people understand that our energy policy, government policy, is based upon this idea of carbon removal and carbon budgets, and that the mathematics just do not stack up? And it's very, very few people who understand that. Very few people understand that the young are being thrown over a cliff, because it's the young who have to pay for carbon removal. Because the date set at COP21 was 2050, the year 2050, after which we're all supposed to be moving over to carbon removal technologies. So the young have to cope with climate breakdown, and they also have to pay for carbon removal. And hardly any young person in the UK understands that double whammy, just how cruel that is. So before I go into a bit more detail about what I was going to say, I thought it was important to link what Simon had said with what I'm going to say. I will kick off by saying that I've been battling the media for many years. And back in the 1990s, the penny dropped on me, the scale to which the media is responsible for distorting public opinion. Back in the 1990s, there was a hell of a battle in the UK between road safety organisations and the government to try and get the UK to reduce the number of children killed on our roads. In the 1990s, the UK had the worst child pedestrian fatality rate of any country in the EU. And efforts were made to try and get the government to act. They declined to act. The John Major government and Tony Blair governments initially declined to act because there was immense hostility to road safety measures in the media, principally the tabloid press, the Sun, the Mirror, Star. Any red top newspaper seemed to be vehemently opposed, particularly the Sun. And they saw this and portrayed this as a war on the motorist. And so what we did, a group of campaigners did, was we took on the politicians. We did mass leaflet drops. When John Major was Prime Minister, we did his constituency. Then Tony Blair was Prime Minister, we did his constituency. And eventually, Tony Blair decided he would act. And we had to do virtually every home in his constituency to get him to act, but he did act. And he set a target to halve the number of children killed on Britain's roads within 10 years. And the Sun really waged an enormous campaign and kept on pushing back against the government. And in the end, the government started to give ground, for instance, having speed cameras painted yellow, that kind of thing. And so that was when I really did take a group I worked with. We took on the Sun newspaper and the editor, and we called for an introduction of a piece of legislation called Wade's Law, named after the editor of the Sun at that time, somebody by the name of Rebecca Wade. And we took that editor on, writing to every MP in the UK, saying we wanted Wade's Law to be introduced to require every national newspaper, every time it published an article about speeding or the government's efforts to tackle speeding, it would also have to have a small box in the article just simply saying the number of children killed by speeding motorists in the previous year. And that seemed to shut up the Sun. It seemed to silence them. They were copied into all correspondence between MPs and the campaign group. And the Sun editor was so embarrassed by this that it seems that they were shut up. So then the Labour government was able to just get on with doing what it wanted to do. More speed cameras, more speed bumps, traffic calming measures. And over the next 7 years, we did reach the target. And we had halved the number of children killed on Britain's roads in 7 years. And we saved the lives of 540 children. Now, the Sun newspaper, the tabloids, did not want 540 children's lives saved. They fought us every inch of the way. It was only when we really pummeled them, really began to expose them in their cruelty, that they began to back off. And I think that was very educational for me, that you have to be very strong in your campaigning. You have to be determined when you are campaigning against people who are killers. Let's be absolutely crystal clear about this. The media will advocate all the time for policies that will kill, particularly the young. So I then moved on to climate change campaigning. I was aware that the media was very reluctant to report on some of the more frightening and embarrassing news that was appearing from the scientific community. In 2004, the World Health Organization said that 140,000 people a year were being killed by climate change. Principally, the main killer was the increased spread of disease. In 2008, the Global Humanitarian Forum said it was 300,000 people killed. The vast majority were children killed every year. In 2012, a Spanish NGO produced a report for the United Nations that said that 400,000 people were then being killed every year due to climate change. Of that number, 360,000 were infants under the age of 1 year. Now, all of those three reports, they only appeared in specialist journals. None of them appeared in the mainstream media. None of them appeared on television. So what I picked up from this was that if it was a particularly embarrassing piece of news that our lifestyles, our government policies kill children, that was not going to be reported to the British people. So it brings me back to this idea that it's not a fully functioning democracy if crucial news and information is withheld from people. So I was aware of the problem, but it wasn't until 2017 that I really got going with a dedicated campaign to try and get the BBC to tell the truth. Up until 2017, the BBC was still allowing climate change deniers on air to claim that climate change wasn't happening. So if you had a scientist go on air to say that climate change is real, it's dangerous, and it's going to cause all manner of problems. It's already beginning to kill people. Then the BBC would put up a climate change denier, and they said that this was providing balance to the audience. And my argument to the BBC was that this was a false balance, that there were no scientists who actually said that CO2 didn't cause global warming, that it was a matter of chemistry and physics, and that the climate change deniers had no basis in science to make the points that they did. They did not belong on air. In fact, there was a serious debate that was going on, and it's something that Extinction Rebellion has picked up on, and that is that the scientists are actually very cautious. They're too cautious. In reality, there probably is no carbon budget left at all. In fact, only emergency action is anywhere near good enough because we're right on the very cusp of climate breakdown. And bodies like groups like Extinction Rebellion would point out key science I turn to in a moment that suggests that runaway climate change could begin. It might already have started, but it could begin, and it could overwhelm humanity in the years to come. And what was needed on the BBC was a discussion, regular discussion on TV and radio between those scientists in the IPCC who said climate change is real and dangerous, but we've still got a bit of time to tackle it. And the scientists on the other hand who were saying, no, we're out of time. We need emergency action. We need it now to slash greenhouse gas emissions really quickly. So I took 3 cases through the BBC's complaints procedure and onto Ofcom. And one of them was on this idea that we needed a debate between those who are alarmed and the mainstream science of the IPCC. So it's a scientific debate between the two, because the BBC wasn't allowing that. I also was concerned the BBC wouldn't report on particularly alarming news. For instance, there'd been a UN Security Council meeting specifically talking about climate change, and the BBC never told the public about that at all, that it was a national security issue that the Security Council was considering. Spent 2 days on it, considering it, and it wasn't mentioned by the BBC anywhere. And then also, I felt that the BBC had hidden from the public, particularly the young, the fact that carbon removal technologies were going to be insanely expensive, that the COP21 agreement was predicated on that, and yet the BBC was not allowing the young to hear what was planned for them. And those cases went on to Ofcom, and Ofcom sided with the BBC. I wasn't too surprised by that, because I think it is an organisation that is there to serve the interests of big business and serve the interests of the BBC. But I think it was very educational for the BBC. It was a tipping point from the BBC, because in 2018, they really did begin to change. It was in 2018 that you noticed a very significant change. I also ought to add that I'd organised small demonstrations outside the BBC, and you can see those online. A lot of them through the Extinction Rebellion websites and what have you. So yes, we also were backing up the cases with protest, and I think both are incredibly important. Both, a key part of how we change a business, a corporation like the BBC, or government policy. And I got a lot of people sort of very concerned about this. In 2018, there was another explosion really, and that was the UN Secretary General wrote to every media outlet in the world, I think, pretty much, and said, I'm going to make a major speech on the upcoming IPCC report in 2018, and I want you to cover it. And he, when he gave his speech, the BBC didn't cover it. And it was very powerful. He said that we now risk runaway climate change. The changes that are happening are hitting us far faster than the scientists predicted. And he said that this is a direct existential threat. So how could it possibly be that our nation is told that we face a direct existential threat, and the BBC decided that that news must not be conveyed to the public? So I organised a lot of people to make a lot of complaints. We made a huge amount of noise. We really put an immense amount of pressure. We wrote to every single director at the BBC, and we informed them, sorry, there's going to be a little bit of noise, just as I say, I'm in a hotel room. So bear with me, there'll be a tiny bit of noise in the background. But so I wrote to every single director as well, and put a lot of pressure on them. And I think that's really where we began to see the BBC doing far more on climate change. They really began to push out the deniers. The climate change deniers were marginalised, but there were still examples where all media were still failing to explain to the public the scale of the threat that we face. All newspapers, whether it be the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, all the right-wing papers, in 2017, 2018, they all began to shift and were telling people that climate change is real and it's dangerous, but they were still hiding the most frightening facts. Now, in 2020, there was a Zoom call with Professor Sir David King and other eminent scientists, and they were asked a direct question. Do you know this, like Extinction Rebellion? Are they exaggerating when they say that billions of people could be killed? Professor Sir David King said, no, they're not. That is the order of magnitude that we can expect. Now, how can it possibly be that such a well-respected scientist says that billions of people could be killed, and that is not somehow headline news in every newspaper and on every TV news bulletin? Now, in 2020 also, this fear that runaway climate change has begun, it just hasn't overwhelmed us yet, was underscored by the fact that NASA and NOAA are responsible for America's sort of satellite observations and climate prediction models, said that they were changing their prediction for when the Blue Ocean event would occur. That's the Arctic Ocean being free of ice in the summer. And they changed their prediction from the 2060s, and they said it's all melting so much more quickly. It will most likely be free in the summer of 2034. Now, again, that did not appear anywhere on TV news bulletins. And yet this could potentially be a global killer. This is really when heating begins to accelerate in the Arctic, because white sea ice that's still there, it's retreating, but it's still there, and it's thinning, but it's still reflecting 90% of the sun's energy back out into space. And when it's gone for 4 months of the year that the sun does not set in the Arctic, from the space, the ocean appears blue or black, dark blue or black, and it absorbs nearly 90% of the sun's energy. It's a tremendous switch that is turned in our planet's climate. Now, I can give you lots of examples of this, but I will mention that the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts Research has warned that billions of people could be killed at 4 degrees Celsius of heating. 4 degrees Celsius of heating, billions of people could be killed. Again, not on your TV news. The head of the UK Environment Agency warned of the collapse of the infrastructure that supports our civilization in February 2021. Hardly any TV news bulletin explained that to the public, that our infrastructure here in the UK that supports our civilization could just begin to collapse and crumble. And hardly anybody knows the severity of the threat. I'll give you a couple more examples. I've got to be careful with time. In June 2021, the Committee on Climate Change issued a risks report. You can see it on their website, and it warns of the disruption to food supplies in the UK. If you go on to page 51 of that report, it's on their website, the June report on risks. It warns about what would happen if the AMOC slows down sufficiently or actually stops. That brings the Gulf Stream and the heat to the UK. And there is great concern about that, about when that might happen. And they warn that that would change our climate dramatically, and we would have so many more frosts and much colder temperatures for much more of the year. And that would do such extreme damage to our agricultural production that it warned effectively of a major collapse in arable farming output in the UK. So at a time when food supplies will be collapsing around the world, they'll also be collapsing here in the UK. Hardly anybody understands the significance of that, because that frightening detail was withheld from the public in the UK. The media, BBC, decided you're not entitled to know. You don't deserve to know. Now, the Professor David King has created a new body in Cambridge, and it's called the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, and they've just published a report in August of this year, and they warn that there is no carbon budget left. It's because of what's happened in the Amazon, where it's now become a net emitter of carbon rather than an absorber of carbon, and because of what's happening in the Arctic Ocean, and because permafrost, the melting of permafrost in Canada and Siberia is actually accelerating. So there's a lot of detail to their report. You can see it online, but they warn that there is now no carbon budget left for 1.5 degrees Celsius. They say we will crash through the 1.5 degrees Celsius limits by 2030, probably 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. And again, you know, hardly anybody in the UK knows about that. Hardly anybody was heard about that report, and it's made up of eminent scientists, but highly respected scientists. And UNICEF have recently, a few weeks ago, published a report on the number of children around the world that are at extreme risk from the impacts of climate change. And they said that 920 million children are now at extreme risk of impacts of climate change associated with water scarcity, 820 million children impacted by heat waves, and 600 million by vector-borne disease. Now, disease is already, we know, the biggest killer by far. So I have given you there lots of examples of the news that doesn't make it through to the public. I want to say just a tiny bit more about carbon removal technologies, because Simon touched on that. When this was reported on a couple of news stations, Sky News did a tiny bit about it, the BBC has done a tiny bit about it, but they've never really explained this link that the young have to pay for this after the year 2050. And what they did was they said, well, look, it's a trial project, it's underway in Iceland. And if you look at any of the TV footage on it, you'll see that it's mentioned that it'll be powered from geothermal energy, and it's capturing 4,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide. Not really explained to people that is absolutely minuscule. A minuscule amount of CO2 that's been captured, and not mentioning a word to people the fact that it costs, the Iceland project is costing $620 a ton to capture. Now, are the young supposed to find trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars or pounds to pay for carbon removal after 2050 when the infrastructure that supports our civilization is collapsing and their food supply is collapsing? The scale of the cruelty of what is being done to the young is being hidden, and I argue it is deliberate. There are so many examples of it that I argue that this is deliberate. I argue of the when I write to the directors of major news organisations like the BBC, I argue that you have stolen from the young the one thing that they needed to defend themselves: information. And it's a damning indictment, and I argue that that is true. That is the cruelty of the people that we are up against. So I think, just to wrap up, I'm a minute over, I think. Just to wrap up, I think that it's really important that all campaigners understand the gravity of the cruelty, the failing, more than failings, it is cruelty. To withhold this kind of information that Simon said and the details that I've given here, it is extreme cruelty to hide this from the public, but particularly hide it from the young, because had the young known, they would have had a chance to defend themselves, to go out on more protests. They don't have to do Extinction Rebellion style protests, but they may well have wanted to send a letter to their local MP. They may well have wanted to go and join a school strike for a couple of hours. And that has been denied to them by the media. The media currently, the Times, Telegraph, Mail, Express will howl in outrage at the cost of decarbonising, saying that the cost of insulating all our homes is too much, the cost of installing an air source heat pump is too much. And they will argue that 2050 imposes a far too great a burden. The target to decarbonise by 2050 imposes far too great a burden upon the poor. The right-wing papers claim that they care about those who are less well off, and they don't mention a single thing about the fact that perhaps if the wealthy paid fair taxation, then maybe the poor could afford these technologies and insulation that would keep us all alive and protect us all from climate breakdown. So the bulk of the press are moved away from climate change denialism and they're into delayism. Some people call it 2050ism. It's this notion that we've got time when we don't have time. We are completely out of time. And we've got a small number of people here today, but others may watch this online later. And I would beg people to please contact me and let's get organised and do more of these, what we call tell the truth style demonstrations. We've been to ITV, we've been to the Telegraph, we've been to the BBC loads of times. We do a lot of them, but they do have an impact. And we are slowly nudging the media in the right direction, nowhere near fast enough, so we need to do more of them. So contact me and we'll do more of the Tell the Truth demonstrations. So that's it, that's me, that's what I've got to say. And thank you very much indeed for listening to me.
Let's go ahead.
Okay, so there's one for John, and and the other for Simon. So the first one to Jon is, what's your explanation or interpretation of the fact that the BBC in particular have been so lax, or whatever you, neglectful? I mean, I know they're improving now, but is there what is the relationship between the BBC and the government, let's say, that means that they are actively willing to hide the truth from the public, and particularly the youth? That's my question to Jon. My question to Simon is, I'm not quite clear whether what you were saying was, Simon, that the idea of tech solutions has actively informed the policies of government, which again are completely slowed down and rely upon technology. Is that sort of baked into the projections that the government has about the future and what it sees itself as doing now? So those are my two questions. I hope they're clear.
Should I go first, Ilya?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I would say that it is political. When David Cameron was Prime Minister, he appointed two senior Conservatives to senior positions at the BBC. And more recently, Tim Davie has been appointed the new Director General of the BBC. He was previously a Conservative councillor and a leader of his local Conservative association. And he appointed somebody Sharp. I'm just struggling to. I think his name's Richard Sharp, as the chairman of the BBC. These are the two most senior positions in the BBC, and Richard Sharp had donated over £400,000 to the Conservative Party. So I think that the connection between government, between Conservative politics, and running the BBC is crystal clear. I mentioned that the right-wing press in the UK will focus upon delaying climate change. It will focus upon the costs of decarbonising, the fact that they perceive electric cars to be less efficient and less convenient than petrol cars. They don't like the sight, perhaps, of wind turbines. It's a series of values and opinions that tend to go with right-wing politics. Not always, but tend to. And I would say that we have a BBC that has been now for many years controlled and directed by that right-wing view. And that right-wing view is that we will sacrifice too much if we decarbonise very quickly, and that our lifestyles will have to change too much if we decarbonise very quickly. And they just are not willing to make those kinds of sacrifices. It's the politics of selfishness, immediate self-interest, and they're not thinking about the impacts for the youngest members of their own families. So it's an extreme end of selfishness. So it's political. And I know, Extinction Rebellion is very much, very concerned not to be political and party political, but that is the truth we face, that if you are on the left wing of politics or the centre ground, you're perhaps a little bit more altruistic. If you're on the right wing, not always, but you tend to be more selfish. And that is the battle that's playing out in the BBC.
Thank you. Thank you.
Simon.
Yeah, thank you. So the answer to your question as to whether these, I'm trying to think of the right word, whether these technological solutions, or I wouldn't call them solutions actually, but I mean these techno fixes, I think is a phrase that a lot of people use. Are those techno fixes baked into UK government policy? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't have the figures in front of me, but if you go to the website of the Committee on Climate Change and you look at the, they have their spreadsheets and everything, which are all published online, and they assume a huge amount of carbon withdrawal, which is what we've been talking about, in future decades, in order to make the figures that they have add up. But I should say it doesn't stop there. An area I'm much more familiar with because we've been doing a campaign here. I'm speaking to you from Southeast London, and we've had a big campaign here about a road project. Essentially £2 billion are going to be spent on a tunnel under the River Thames, which is right next door to the Blackwall Tunnel, supposedly to ease traffic congestion. And we've been campaigning not only the basis that it's bad in terms of air pollution, from which school children die every year, but also because what we need, if we are serious about tackling climate change, is a reduction of the amount of traffic on the road. It's not rocket science. We've seen it's possible during the pandemic with people working at home. We have, some of us have visited like Barcelona or Amsterdam, cities where there is less traffic. So this is not rocket science, but we're up against, and I mean, I hear what you say, John, but to look at it from a different angle, what you say about the politics of selfishness, I mean, I would call this the politics of power and wealth, and relationships of power and wealth in society, which often go along with an incredible amount of selfishness. So these things are connected. But I mean, my emphasis would certainly be on the power and wealth, the structures of power and wealth, which determine politics. And what's incredible when you do these campaigns we've been doing on transport is that both the government, controlled by the Conservative Party, and the Greater London Authority, controlled by the Labour Party, are both very clear that we need to build more roads, have more traffic. Oh, but don't worry, they're going to be electric cars. But, you know, the engineers and I mean, the UK Energy Research Council or anybody, they don't have to have any kind of political take. Anyone who understands how a car works will tell you that unless you're producing 100% of that electricity from renewables, like if you're in Paraguay or Iceland, it is a different story, because then, yes, it does help to decarbonize if you have electric cars. But if you produce, I mean, if you go to India or China, where there are lots of people who want to buy those cars, if you go there where you produce your electricity from coal, it's actually worse to have electric cars. And the situation in the UK, where the electricity is mostly produced by gas, is we're kind of in the middle, right? But when you read the brochures from car companies who are selling people electric SUVs, you realize there is a cultural problem, right? I mean, we have to have an attitude to climate change which says, hey, guys, don't spend your lives sitting in traffic jams. You know, spend your lives doing something nice, which would also not screw up the planet. You know, the whole transport policy is completely based on electric cars. Nothing about just, you know, making our streets nicer, I mean, it's not true, nothing. I'm exaggerating. There is something in the policy of the GLA and indeed of the government. Yes, let's put in bike lanes and so on and so on. But I mean, again, anybody who cycles knows what they mean by bike lanes. You know, they don't mean close off a few streets so the people can go along as they do in Amsterdam, reading their papers and on their phones and nice and relaxed with their children biking along. I mean, if you bike in London, you're in fear of your life in a lot of places. So the whole culture has to change. But what we get is not a cultural change, we get a techno fix. And I'd say one last thing, I think there's an analogy with the way the government has tackled the pandemic, which, you know, we all know about only too well. They've taken the techno fix, and believe me, I'm absolutely pro-vaccines. I've been double vaccinated. I argue with friends who question, you know, get vaccinated for goodness sake. But what the government have refused to do is to combine the vaccine, which actually is so unlike an electric car, it's a really good technology. But they've refused to combine that technology with a public health policy, because there's nothing they hate more than things that are based on local councils, the National Health Service, services for people. I'm afraid that, you know, it's ingrained in this government that, you know, if we're not buying and selling it, then it's not a service anyway. You all know all about that. We've all lived through the pandemic. But I do think there's an analogy. And I'd also say that in terms of the press coverage, I've just read this book by Ben Goldacre, Bad Science, which was written 10 years ago about the way that the press covered medical issues. And actually, it's incredibly resonant when you think about the way that the press tackles climate issues. So I mean, completely with you, John, on all the things you said about just missing out the stuff that hurts. But I think there's also an issue with, and certainly this is what Ben Goldacre puts his finger on, even where journalists think they're trying, they don't make enough effort. And it's not the journalists. I was a journalist for many years. It's not the journalists. It's about the whole context that they're working in, the pressure from the editors, the owners, and all the rest of it. They're not given the space, if you like, to make enough effort, to get the science right and to report it accurately. And I think that was certainly part of the problem with all the scandals this guy talks about in the book about MRSA and the MMR vaccines and all the kind of false propaganda that was put out in the press about that. And I think, there's an analogy with the way the press covers climate as well.
Thanks, Simon. If you're all happy with me giving a final summary, there's a question from Peter. Yes, please.
Yes, Jonathan, in the BBC News reports aviation and holidays, and they never seem to invite anyone to demonstrate the damage it does to our economy and our health. Is there any way to address that? I mean, public broadcasting has a duty, doesn't it, to inform and give a balanced view, but they seem to have a very one-sided perspective, which they promote.
Yes, indeed, I agree. ITV is actually the worst of the broadcasters. It has made a huge effort to try and get aviation going, providing just one side of the story, one side of the argument, and vigorously supports the expansion of aviation. The BBC tends to give a more balanced approach, but it's still overwhelmingly, it's more balanced than ITV, but it's still pro-aviation. And you've got another industry that's just beginning, and that's space tourism, and ITV are just over the moon about it. Excuse the pun, but they love it. They're constantly praising this as a great news story, and neither the BBC nor the ITV properly explain to people the CO2 implications of aviation. They don't explain the non-CO2 emissions, the radiative forcing element that's associated with it, that it's not just the CO2 that heats the atmosphere. There are other aspects of aviation associated with aviation that heat the atmosphere. And that after the year 2050, if you go along with the Climate Advisory Council's, Climate Advisory Group's science, that there is no carbon budget left, what that means is after the year 2050, the young have to pay to take out of the atmosphere all the carbon dioxide that we're dumping into the atmosphere today. So you've got a crazy situation where the young have no idea that they have to pay for the family flight. When they go on a family holiday, the youngest member of that family has to pay for it. And they pay after the year 2050, and they pay them because it's too expensive for the politicians to agree to pay it today. So I think that there are a number of truths, number of facts about aviation that are hidden from the public, and there is no impartiality. If the BBC and ITV were impartial and professional, they would have one person arguing for the early resumption of aviation and somebody who's very concerned about COVID and COVID variants saying, no, that's irresponsible. And then they would turn to somebody who's concerned about a direct existential threat. Remember, our issue is about the very survival of our species and all life on this earth. Then they would turn to somebody like us and who would say, no, none of us should be flying. We actually have to stop the aviation tourism industry, and we have to stop it now. Unless somebody can magic up some genuinely carbon neutral fuel, then that industry has to stop. So yeah, there's no balance, and voices like that from the perhaps the environmental movement that says aviation tourism has got to stop, they're banned. They are definitely banned from Sky, from ITV, from BBC, local radio, television. So that harder line view on climate breakdown, that is censored, outright censored. So hopefully, Peter, that's answered your question.
So if possible, may I just ask Simon, thanks, that's John, that's fantastic. Simon, the IPPC third group, some of the that has been leaked to in Spain, I think, and I understand it's talking about mitigation is the focus of the third group. Are there major political and economic changes of lifestyle that they recommend, or have you had a chance to look at that?
Are you talking about the sixth assessment report?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay. Well, no, Peter. Obviously, I live a very sheltered life, obviously, because I didn't know that the part on mitigation had been released. Obviously, I was aware that the first part on the sort of hard science has been released a few weeks ago. I've looked at it and it's on my pile to sort of give it a thorough read, but I didn't know that I did not know that the part on mitigation had been released. So I'll look forward to that.
Hasn't been released officially, Simon.
Right. Okay. Leaked. Yeah.
But,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think I think we know from the previous reports that again, we've got to be very aware that the scientists and the engineers who work on these reports, most of whom are fantastic people and do great research, are really caught and they're caught in the framework of the report. I mean, I know that in the fifth assessment report, the words that stick in my mind from the mitigation part of the report, and let's see if they're in the sixth report as well. The words that stuck in my mind were at the beginning where they talk about fossil fuel use, and they kind of say confidently that the two main drivers that increase fossil fuel use are the increase of population and economic expansion. And straight away, that for me is a massively contested issue, and the controversies that surround that are not. I mean, I think they may. I don't want to say they don't appear at all. I think they may be referred to in passing somewhere in the kind of thousands of pages. But I mean, the introduction is that's the only part the politicians read, if any. The introduction says it's population and economic expansion. It immediately gets you away from, and this was the subject of my book, which Elliot kindly mentioned at the start, that fossil fuels mostly are consumed by and through these big technological systems within which we live and over which we have no control. So, I mean, for all I've said about cars, if you're a single mum with 3 kids and you're trying to get from to the other side of London to visit your mum, going on public transport is really hard. That's the system that person lives in. That's not that person's fault. I mean, why can't there be free public transport which actually carries people along the journeys that they need? It's completely practical, it's completely possible in order to slash the amount of cars on the road. And of course, anyway, it's not, it's mostly not single mums with 3 kids who are driving through the Blackwall Tunnel at rush hour with the traffic piling up and causing the London authorities to want to build this new tunnel. Right? These are people going to work to park in their subsidised spaces. So it's the whole system is what consumes the fuels, and it's not. I mean, much as I respect people who don't fly and who try to limit who don't have a car and who try their best to live with a minimal impact on ecology, we've got to be realistic about what we can do as individuals. And it is these systemic solutions, and of course they are mentioned in the mitigation reports, but never a suggestion that maybe we should turn the whole economy upside down in some ways. Maybe we should have types of collective ownership. Maybe we should think about the profit motive and its impact and the way that it distorts what the economy does, and so on and so on. All that is kind of very clearly ruled out of what's mentioned the report. I mean, having said that, I mean, there is more from the UN agencies, the UN Environment Programme, and Jonathan mentioned earlier, I think the General Secretary of the UN. I mean, they are making statements which, you know, from the standard of 15, 20 years ago, kind of sound incredibly politically radical. How that all tumbles out in practice is something for all of us.
Whatever the change we are going to make, it needs to have social justice as at the core of the strategy. And this is actually the topic of the next session we're going to have, possibly next week. It's about eco justice. We were after some more speakers, but we'll see if we manage. So if you're happy with the very short summary of what we had today, it's more than 1 hour session. I think it was very, very informative. Simon, it didn't take long to Simon to demystify the net zero, the net zero plan 2050. So I think there's very strong arguments against that. And so we are in an emergency, clearly, but we've been first denied about this, then we've been lied about this, as Jonathan reminded us very, very brilliantly by the press and TV broadcasters. Now they are trying to tell us a different story where we can have a better future relying on these technologies that can capture carbon from the atmosphere, that situation is not that bad and that we can make it in ways that are not clear to the most of us. The problem is exactly that most of the people, especially working class people, have not access to the right information to really assess the extent, the vastity of the problem that we're dealing with. So I think I can only just thank you so very much for joining us today and for these talks. And I hope next events are also going to be as informative. That's all from me. And again, thanks very much, Simon and John, and for all to all the people who attended, Peter included, who stayed so far. And thanks, Miran as well, who joined us lately. Okay, that's all. Enjoy your weekend and take care.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.